So recently, I got to host a panel discussion about why New Orleans, and especially the French Quarter, are so connected in people's imaginations with stories about the supernatural and especially stories about vampires. This was all put together by my good friend Lady Delaney, who is a miniaturist and also just someone who knows a lot of the coolest people in New Orleans. She got together our panel. We had Alys Arden, who grew up in the French Quarter and has written novels about vampires, Marita Crandle, who has written fiction and nonfiction and owns a series of vampire-themed shops and restaurants in the French Quarter. And we had Owen Ever from the New Orleans Pharmacy Museum, who talked to us about how these stories connect with the history of science and the history of medicine. And we got to do all of this at the Olivier House, this really charming historic hotel in the French Quarter, where we basically borrowed the parlors from the cats who own them. And the human who owns the place, Bobby Danner, was kind enough to show us around afterwards and to host a little after party at the Siquez mansion across the street, this one-of-a-kind historic building. This was a really cool event. And if you are ever in New Orleans, you should follow Lady Delaney because she hosts classes and scavenger hunts, and once in a while gets a wild hair and puts together something big and ambitious like this. This particular event we have on tape for you. Our friends James and Jamie were kind enough to show up and video the whole thing. So that is what you are about to see, and for an introduction to the subject matter, I will pass the mic off to my past self. Have fun. So, I gathered just from talking with a few of y'all, we have a mixture of locals and visitors. Love to have people who are new to town. It's always so cool to be part of a first impression. And I think all of us, obviously, just by being here, have some level of personal familiarity with the French Quarter. As you dig into its history more and as you get to know it better, the Quarter is this kind of border zone between a lot of different things. Culturally, it's kind of American, kind of European, kind of Caribbean, kind of African, kind of Latin. It is also a place that people tend to pass through briefly. It's this sort of point of arrival and point of departure all at the same time. Before it was New Orleans, it was Bolbancha. It was the indigenous trading ground, this place of many languages where you came to get your work done and move on. It became an immigrant destination, so people came here from other parts of the world, not knowing what they were in for, found their feet for a second and moved on. Come World War II, it's the point of embarkation for the military, for a big chunk of the US military, who came through, soldiers and sailors, to like eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow they may die. And of course now it is a tourist destination. So for all of those reasons, as much as this is a historic neighborhood, as much as like history is right in front of you and touchable all the time, it's also true that on any given night in the Quarter, for most people in the neighborhood, it's brand new. So another weird contradiction about it. And it is also always a place that kind of lives on this cusp between life and death. Life's always been kind of hard here, between the climate and the mosquitoes that it generates, and on the other hand, the constant churn of new people, the amount of germs being kind of comparable to a daycare center. It has various qualities. Also, I mean, the harder stuff, the hard work that has always had to be done to keep this place running, the packed, tight living conditions, the burnout, the temptations, the exploitation. There's always been reasons why stories tended to end a little prematurely here. So you can feel from all of those things, there's a lot of reasons why this neighborhood lends itself to the things we're going to be talking about tonight. Stories about life after death and life that transcends death, and things that just kind of break the rules. It is also a place that gets to be an exception to a lot of people's beliefs. It's a place you go to do things you can't get away with anywhere else. It's a great place to be a nonconformist. It's a great place to be a con man. It's a great place to disappear. It is also the neighborhood where I was one day giving a historic tour next to a pretty little park, finishing up the dramatic beats of my final story when a scruffy young man in cut-up clothes leapt out of a bush, crawled on all fours over to me, and started chewing on my leg. And that was the tale of the French market that day. So, like, this place is a mess, and it is one of the things that makes it so wonderful is all the things I said previously. You can imagine a place that would take itself really seriously based on those things. This is a neighborhood that also has the capacity to laugh at itself, and it is one of the best things about the place. So, all of that together, I think, covers the kind of wonderful variety of common ground that these folks share. Maybe more than anything, the Quarter is a place where stories happen and where storytellers really find a niche for themselves. And the folks we have for y'all tonight are a combination of storytellers, neighborhood residents, neighborhood professionals, and people who have spent a lot of time down in like the cracks of those contradictions and finding all the fertile stuff that's down in there. So I want to introduce these folks to y'all. I'm going to brag on them a little bit and their accomplishments. And I would love for y'all to introduce yourselves a little more personally by answering a pretty open-ended question, which is, what is the most French Quarter thing that has ever happened to you? I will start with Alys Arden. So here closest to me, we have Alys. So Alys is a born and raised French Quarterite. I guess I just made that up, but the rare instance of someone who actually like was a kid in the French Quarter and left New Orleans, did some amazing things out around the world, and decided to come home. And Alys, as far as what we are doing today, is best known as a novelist. Alys is the writer of a series of books, young adult fantasy fiction, but I will say the kind of young adult fiction that adults can really enjoy reading, which begins with a book called The Casket Girls, based on the legend of the same name. So we definitely have some fictional things to get into tonight. Also, in the real world, Alys finds time to be one of the co-hosts of maybe the biggest vampire event in the world, the Anne Rice Vampire Ball, which is later this month. Woo, home stretch. So, all of that said, thank you for spending time with us tonight. What's the most French Quarter thing that's ever happened to you?
I feel like the most French Quarter thing that has ever happened to me is too morbid to kick this off with. So
Second most French Quarter.
I'm going to just talk about something tonight. So I was getting ready. I mean, this was just 2 hours ago.
Wonderful.
I was sitting at my desk doing my makeup, as one does, and I have like a wall of plants, and there was a crash. And I look up, and just one of the potted plants had somehow just walked off the shelf and like smashed on the floor. And I was like, well, we're going to talk about ghosts tonight, so this seems fitting.
Between the floors and the ghosts, nothing stays where you put it in this neighborhood. Next down the line, we have Marita Crandle. So those of you who spent time in the Quarter before, if you don't know Marita, you have stumbled across Marita's influence. So Marita is perhaps most visible in the Quarter as the mind behind a series of vampire-themed businesses that y'all may have noticed. So we have most recently the Vampire Apothecary, fairly recently opened, so congratulations on that, which is right around the corner. Great post-game option after our reception if anyone needs that. And we also have the Vampire Cafe, the Boutique du Vampire on Royal Street, and as far as I'm aware, the only password-protected speakeasy in the entire city, Potions, which is located on Bourbon Street above Fritzl's Jazz Pub. So that is one piece of Marita's many-faceted career. On the other hand, also a writer, and I think certainly one thing we'll get into tonight is a book called New Orleans Vampires, History and Legend, which digs into the backing behind some of the most widely told vampire legends in New Orleans. And as of very, very recently, a published fiction writer as well, congratulations on that, with Mosquito New Orleans Vampires, which we will certainly get a chance to talk a little bit more about too. So lots of stuff going on in this one's life. Thank you so much for making some time. What's the most New Orleans thing, French Quarter thing that's ever happened to you?
I have so many. This one is not vampire related, but I wrote a book about Johnny White's Sports Bar, which was a bar where I worked for several years. And after Katrina, when I came back, I was kind of gathering stories because there were so many interesting ones. And this artist, Jimmy Lala, he was in charge of taking care of people's animals here. And so he would go, people would call and say, hey, I left and my animals are in my home. So he would take all these things down and he would break windows and leave a note that he was there if he saw an animal inside. Anyway, he was bringing food to that's one of the homes, and he was driving from Johnny White's, where he got the food, to the Maroney. And these little kids saw his bike and they said, hey man, we want your bike. And he's like, no, I'm feeding animals, can't stop. He kept going, and then he heard the gunshot. And then he felt it, and he saw blood going down his leg. And he's like, oh my God. And he kept going. And when he finally stopped, he's like, okay, he checked out how bad it was. He's like, what is this? And then he looked in his backpack. He had a can of Chef Boyardee. And it went, doo-doo, and it saved his life.
Oh my God.
French Quarter
A culinary miracle.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah.
Raise a glass to Chef Boyardee.
I
That's
know.
incredible.
I feel like we need to tell them that story.
I know.
Chef
I
Boyardee.
did send it to them.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I would. If I were in the marketing department, I would be like, yes,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
no.
Yeah, they never really got back to me.
We also have Owen Ever, who, first and foremost, as far as tonight's theme is concerned, identifies as a future ghost. So we'll get into that. But when there's time to spare from that activity, also works at the New Orleans Pharmacy Museum, which I would say, we love all the museums in the neighborhood equally, but it's most of our secret favorite. And Owen actually created the tour program there, so the whole storytelling dimension of like bringing out the human dimension of a collection that could, via the artifacts and via the kind of esoteric nature of a lot of the history there, could easily be kind of difficult and alienating. Owen has really specialized in finding a way to humanize and bring all that stuff into like visceral life. So in addition to that, on the science communications front, Owen is also recently the host of a podcast with the very clear and very enticing title of A Field Guide to Gay Animals. So you can hit that up. And then on the side, in between all these other things, has also found some time with Goat in the Road Theater to co-create some immersive live experiences in French Quarter historic spaces. Something like that going on right now, but definitely a resume item that we will be interrogating. So all that said, Owen, what's the most French Quarter thing that's ever happened to you?
Wow, a lot of things came to mind, and I was like, untoward, not appropriate. Don't mention it. And then something did come to mind because of what you were saying about the tendency for timelines to overlap in this city. In one of these productions, the first one we did about yellow fever at Madame John's Legacy, one of the oldest buildings in the French Quarter, I was there like all night upholstering a half-teaster bed, and in the morning, the rain came and I might have just fallen asleep. And when I woke up, I heard the sound of a brass band. And when I tell you I had no idea what time it was, I mean, I have no idea what century I was in. And I just was wandering around, not even knowing if I was corporeal anymore, until a busker got into a fight with another busker, and then someone started playing Beyonce. And I was like, this is New Orleans. This is like, that moment of slippage is so real.
I think that was all 4 centuries of New Orleans' life packed into one.
Yeah.
Big, little boxes ticked everywhere. Y'all, if you didn't know already, you can see that this is a neighborhood replete with ridiculous stories. So with that in mind, there's so many directions we could start off in, but I would love to kick off the meat of the matter with Alys, because you are a unicorn. Like, people who grew up in the Quarter, and specifically who have like multi-generational French Quarter families, it's a really unusual thing these days. I mean, the neighborhood speaks to the kid in all of us, but you were a kid here, a real biological kid. And so I would love to hear from you a little bit about like what that was like, and specifically, given our focus tonight, if you had a sense as a kid growing up of like a neighborhood folklore, particularly a supernatural folklore, but like stories that were in the air before tour guiding became the mechanism for folklore in the neighborhood.
I mean, the most far back memory of like actual supernatural folklore before, I think, paranormal commercialism was the ghost of Julie at Bottom of the Cup Tea Room. In their, I don't know if it was the original location, but when I was a kid, the location on Royal Street. If you've never been to Bottom of the Cup Tea Room, I highly encourage you to go there, even though it's in a different location on charter now. So it's the oldest psychic institution in the country, and I think it's been there since like 1920. And so I grew up a lot in that place. If you've read book 2 of the Casket Girls, then a lot of the experiences in Bottom of the Cup Tea Room were from me growing up there, working there as a teenager, and my mother worked there when she was a teenager. So we just have a lot of history there. And so I feel like that's the first ghost story that I really remember as a kid. But I definitely can remember in the late 90s, like a very kind of distinct shift to like the capitalism of the paranormal. And there was a coffee shop behind the cathedral, which ironically, the Boutique de Vampire
It became Boutique de
Oh,
Vampire.
really?
So
Kit
weird.
became, where I worked when I was a teenager, and the coffee shop in the book, of course, is modeled after that one. And I remember this tour guide from the 90s who would stop in every day, and I would have to hear the same stories over and over again. So, of course, that is featured in the series. And so, to me, that's kind of where the shift started. And I do definitely think that had a lot to do with Anne Rice's, productions in the 90s, and the movie Interview with the Vampire really, of course, we've always been a very, very supernatural place, but I think as far as the commercialism of it, I think that had to do with that big boom.
I will say, to this day, that story is told at that spot, even
Oh,
though the
good.
business is not there anymore. If you walk
Well,
by that
she's
spot,
still there.
right behind Jackson Square, the ghost is the continuity,
Yeah,
even if
yeah.
the business changes.
Yeah.
1920 was old news for her. I would like to bring it down to Marita. So, Marita, you, in contrast with the born and raised experience here, you're a transplant to the French Quarter, and you went really quickly through the process of being a visitor and getting your first impression, to being a resident, to being a business owner, and within the span of less than 2 years?
Yeah.
All of that? Wow. So I'm curious, for you as a visitor, what was your first impression of the Quarter? And for you now having been an institution in the Quarter for a good long while, how much does that first impression still hold up?
Oh, it still is. And when I first stepped foot in the Quarter, my company put me up at the Sheraton, and they had rented me a convertible. And I got here in the middle of the night because I didn't
Wait.
realize it.
How long ago was this?
This was 1998.
Okay.
Yeah. And that was the very first time I came. And so I didn't want to be in the Sheraton, so I went to, somebody told me you have to go to bottom of the cup tea room. And so I was on my way to the convention center, but I thought, let me just poke my head this way. And I went in, and the gentleman said, I told him, I really want a bed and breakfast. Do you know any place? He says, well, you know what? We have a really good reader here. Why don't you have your cards read, and then by the time you come out, I'll have a place for you. And I thought, I really want to do that at nighttime, but okay. So I did it, and sure enough, he had somebody. It was, at the time, it was Dick Merrill of Merrill Lynch, and he had just bought a place called he named it Guest Bridges, and he's related to Freddie Guest, who's a really great artist here. Anyway, he was so proud of his place and everything, and that was my first ghost experience. But so, I mean, the French Quarter it made me sick when I had to leave. I felt so heartsick that on one trip, I got a little apartment here, and I just never left. I sold my house over the phone. I moved here Halloween weekend to promote vampire wine, and I didn't have any electricity. He forgot to put my electricity on, and it was a nightmare, but it's so magical. And I sold my house over the phone and got my dogs and my cars and moved here, and the rest is history.
And to make it work, you did one of the things that people have classically done here for quite a while, which is you bartended for a bit.
Yes.
And there is
11
a
years.
bartender view on the folklore of the neighborhood. People talk to their bartenders. So can you tell us a little bit about the view of the neighborhood supernatural stories you
So
got from
much.
that?
I mean, I
wrote a book on it.
I was right across the street from the Bourbon Orleans Hotel, and everything here is haunted, So people say, where's a haunted hotel? Well, they're all haunted. But I didn't really believe in ghosts before I moved here, but I've had 3 of my own stories. So anyway, I was at the bar, and a man came in, and he goes, give me a shot of anything. And he was really white. And I said, what happened? And he says, well, I'm the foreman over there, and I'm in the ballroom, and I was working on electrical stuff, and I looked, and all of a sudden there was a soldier across the room from me, in like a little guy in an old soldier outfit, but then I just got chills thinking about it. Then he floated up into the air and looked down at me. He goes, and I'm not going back. So yeah, but there's so many. That's just
Sure.
I have one after the other, not just about that hotel, but all about the Quarter.
We are stacking up conversation starters, y'all, for the reception later on. Obviously, more questions to ask. Let's bring it down to Owen. So Owen, getting into this kind of like cross-pollination between the lived experience of the neighborhood and this kind of fuzzier, more legendary, more fictional stuff. So you work at a place that crosses this paradoxical line in a really interesting way. So for those who haven't been to the Pharmacy Museum was a medical institution for a big chunk of the 19th century. So it's a building where really intense things happened to people. People went there with high hopes. Great pain was experienced there. Horror was experienced there. And So there is this thread of the history of the place that is very anecdotal and very emotional and very personal. At the same time, it's a museum. There's this impetus to cite your sources. It also is a museum about science. There's this pressure for empiricism. So how do you and the folks who do this Pharmacy Museum miracle, how do y'all think about crossing that boundary between like the measurable and the personal?
Well, we do it with humor. That's, I think, one of the most important things. And I started at the museum in 2011, I believe. You can fact check me. So I've been there quite some time. And it's wild to have a job as a museum professional slash like science communicator where at the beginning of every tour I do have to do expectations management around the fact that you may be impacted by some sort of spiritual energy because the amount of people that pass out in that space. And I think a huge part of that is, to your point, that there's a reason why medical establishments are among the most haunted in the American landscape, because it's a place where people are going with great suffering and great hope. And I think that energy really resonates in that space. And it's something that I contend with, it's something we all contend with. You really feel it, especially since it's a place where not only was it a functional practice, but we have brought in artifacts and instruments from all over. And so we have a lot of like concentrated energy around all of those tools and the stories that they hold that we won't ever really know. And so my job as a historian storyteller is to look at like what is the evidence, like what are the things that are based in reality that we can talk about. We can talk about Dr. Louis Duffiot, this gentleman who became the first licensed pharmacist, the first licensed medical practitioner in the United States in 1816, and it's because of his legacy that we have this 200-year-old building. It's incredible. We also know that, he did a lot of great charitable things. There was a lot of medical advancement. We also know that the history of medicine in the United States is incredibly fraught and incredibly full of a lot of oppression and suffering and abuse. That's not all written down. And so there is this big gap between what we do know, what is written down, and what we feel to be true, and what we anecdotally know to be true. And what is that space in between? I think that space is where legend and lore and story and superstition really serve us. Like in my most generous idea, that's the utility of it. It's to help us reckon with all of that darkness that we don't have a historic record for. And so I've had an adversarial relationship with the tour guides in the past where I'm like, fact check that, sir. But I'm older and wiser now, and I recognize that since the 19th century, people have been in New Orleans confronting the unknowable and the great fear, so much mystery, and have been trying to make sense of it, trying to communicate it to each other, trying to warn each other of things, and also trying to remind each other that people have been here before and have gone through a lot and are still there. And I think that's so important. And so, yeah, I'm a historian, but I'm a storyteller. And so I'm also guilty of like over-reducing things and getting to the good nuggets of the story. Like I do that as well, so come take a tour for sure. I think there's a danger in over-relying in what is factually proven. It doesn't tell the whole story. We all know that.
Yeah.
There's also a danger of just like taking every ghost story at face value. Everything is nuanced. Everything is nuanced. And so trying to figure out the two of those, trying to find that space in between is fascinating.
It's very interesting trying to unravel some of the history, and I feel like I'm not, an academic historian, but I've learned so much about history and the way history was recorded here. This was actually from the Archdiocese archivist, how once something was written back in the day, that was treated as fact. And then it would get cited in another book, and then that would get cited in another book. And suddenly, just like that one dude that wrote that book, it's been cited 70 times. So of course now, or in the past 50 years, that's like, well, of course this is the truth. I mean, it's been cited this many times, but it was just like that one guy. And it's very interesting as a fiction writer, because I think it helps, especially like a super type A person like me, find creative license in things when you are trying to make them as historically accurate as possible. Sorry, I went
No, that's great.
all over the place.
So Marita has, as I mentioned earlier, wrote a book that is about interrogating the historical context to different degrees behind 3 vampire stories that are commonly told in the neighborhood, which for those who have ever been on a ghost tour or taken a vampire tour, we're talking about the story of the Carter brothers, the story of Jacques Saint-Germain, and most importantly and most kind of substantially, the story of the Casket Girls. And obviously, common ground here, y'all were doing research on some of the same stuff. And researching the Casket Girls, I mean, this is, I really want to know, like, okay, this brought you into the Historic New Orleans collection. This brought you
Tulane
into
University, I mean, you name it. And the thing where I found as a researcher, I go to the 10th degree. Like, I want to know exactly. If it's not written, then it's not true. And exactly what Alys said is that so many people in the past take somebody's word for it. It's amazing. They just don't want to do the work. And I found a lot of things in footnotes, you know, that were very, very valuable. But yeah, it's, I mean, amazing how many, they call themselves historians, just decided, well, this seems like this was probably what happened. And it's so obviously not what happened, you know, but I mean, it took hours and hours of research to get to the really nitty-gritty of it.
Did you find, I mean, to the extent that when you're going to an archive, you're talking to people, which obviously most of your time is spent in the resources, in books, but when you're asking people for help, what is a researcher or an archivist in New Orleans, what's the reaction you get when you say, this is what I'm hunting for?
No, Bobby Tickner
Yeah.
at the New Orleans Historic Collection, unbelievable.
Unflappable.
Like, amazing. He was so helpful, and he knew I was writing a vampire book, but he also saw the degree of research that I did.
Yeah.
And he was, I mean, so helpful with all of my books, like every time I've gone there. And it just, amazing. And it makes you feel so special when you go there too. You have to, you know, take the little class at first or the video, and you only get a pencil. And I don't know, just, I love the feeling of being in that place. I don't want to leave. Like, I can be there all day.
To the background, the history behind your books, Alys, so you also chose, among the many legends that there were to pull from, you decided to focus your debut, right here, on the Casket Girls. Why that particular story? What was it about that legend and the history behind it that felt like it was worth spinning a novel on?
Shortly before I started writing, I was introduced to a member of my family that I had not known growing up, who was an Ursuline
Oh, wow.
nun. And when I met her, she was like definitely the coolest person in my family. And she was like 86 at the time. And I was kind of dumbfounded. Like, how is a nun the coolest person in my family? And because the only thing that only experience I had ever had with nuns were like in elementary school, like getting slapped with rulers and stuff. So so she told me a lot about the Ursulines, and she was very feminist, this cousin. And I was like, wait a second, what are you talking about? And the idea was, if I am a nun, I answer to God and not man. And I was like, oh, that's so good. And it really like reframed, everything that I had ever thought, and really was like showing me a lot of my biases when it came to this. And so I really got to know a lot of the nuns, the elder nuns at the Ursulines here in New Orleans. And at the same time, I had kind of bought my house in the quarter. I was living in London at the time, and it was very close to the Ursuline, what's now the Old Ursuline Museum. And if you haven't been there, you definitely need to go. And so it was this trifecta, which I'll get to the third part now. So it was my cousin, the Jubilee Ursuline, kind of moving close to the convent. And then I was not writing yet. I had a very different career in life. And I took as a New Year's resolution this like fantasy writing workshop. And this is like in the Twilight heyday, and everyone in this class was a little bit more like fantasy focused than horror, where I was coming from. And I didn't know anything about fantasy, sci-fi, Twilight, like any of this stuff, but it was all adults in the class, and all they did was talk about how much they hated Twilight and hated Stephenie Meyer. And I was like, good God, like how do you people hate this teen thing so much? This is so dumb to me. And I was like, well, then I'm definitely gonna write a teen vampire story for this class because that's the kind of person that I am. And I just, happened to be spending all this time like thinking about the Ursulines and the convent and the vampire urban legend there. And I was like, well, I gotta write a teen vampire story because everyone in this class already hates me. So I'm gonna make them read this. And that's literally how it started.
Wow.
And then it just changed my life completely. And yeah, I'm now in book 5.
Marita, in the book where you look at the Casket Girls story, you, without spoiling the specifics too much, you kind of rip it to shreds. Like the legend as
Don't
usually
read her
told
book
by
before
tour
you
guides.
read my book.
No, but
There is a correct order,
well, I
yes.
do, but I don't. I mean, I still let the legend live on.
Yes. Well, actually, that's exactly what I'm thinking of, is you make such an interesting, and I did not at all see this coming, choice at the end of your chapters about the Casket Girls. And for those not familiar, this is a story told at the old Ursuline convent on Charters Street, oldest building in the neighborhood more than likely, one of the oldest in the Mississippi Valley. So you dig deep into the facts of it, and some people might be like, okay, sure, the lore and the facts are different, fine. You, instead, you take the facts and you retell the legend to take all the facts into account, which I thought was brilliant. I would love to know, are there now tour guides telling your version of the story?
Oh yeah, they use it for tour guides all the time.
That's
Like,
so
it's
cool.
Mandatory reading before they go, and tour guides come and thank me all the time to
Yeah.
have written it. So, and that was the thing too. I used to hear. This is actually very funny. Before I had my Vampire Cafe, I would sit outside the shop sometimes, and tours would sit there, or even when I have the cafe, and they're in between the two, and they'll be like, yeah, if you ever get to see the owner, she's got real fangs, which I was born with my teeth, but she never comes out during the day, and I'm sitting there, the sun's beating on me. And
I've heard people say that as well. Yeah.
That is promotion. That is
Yeah.
pure promo.
Yeah.
Do not bust that bubble. Owen, you have some really fascinating perspective on there being so much flexibility about vampire stories. They have different sort of traits over time. You have some great stuff about 19th century vampire stories and the kind of public health intersection. Can you share some of that with us?
Ooh, vampires intersecting with public health. That's what we're all here for. Yeah. I mean, why is there so much grandeur and mythology and superstition associated with the city? And I think it's like not only do we have all these different cultures and cosmologies and faith systems overlapping, we also have so many epidemics coming, so many ways to die in this city. It was called by outsiders the wet grave, or the Acropolis of the South in the 19th century, which is a PR nightmare. And New Orleans has always been good at being like, oh, you think that? We'll mythologize ourselves. We'll tell our own stories about what's happening so we can sort of gain some control over that. And I think vampires were a huge part of that here in New Orleans, as well as also in New England, where there was also a lot of vampire fear and superstition, because people didn't understand transmission. They didn't understand how one disease would go from one person to another person. And in the Victorian era, they certainly didn't want to talk about sexually transmitted diseases at all. So you end up with people mysteriously getting syphilis. And it's a lot easier to say oh, a vampire did this than to admit to having had some sort of actual liaison in the brothel. I mean, many people were willingly admitting that in the 19th century, but that became a way of navigating this in a coded sense. I've read accounts where people talk about the description of vampirism being one-to-one, the same as a diagnosis of consumption. Do you know what consumption is? We call it tuberculosis. So it's a pulmonary illness. It does make you real pale, real light sensitive, blood mysteriously coming from your mouth. How do you explain that in a time when you don't understand germ theory? What is happening? How does that jump from one person to another person? So you turn to science, which is its own mythology, its own sort of practice and reflection of cultural beliefs, and they don't have anything. They're champagne and oysters and bloodletting, I don't know. And then you turn to superstition, and they're okay, so that person has died of vampirism, get rid of the body. Don't keep it just sitting out in the home. You're gonna limit the amount of transmission that's happening. And so people are using these stories in order to protect themselves and to explain the inexplicable. And a lot of our understanding of like vampire, of like the image of vampire, does come from Bram Stoker, very popular author of vampirism. And he was directly using his experiences with consumption and with syphilis, two things that he knew firsthand, to describe what this effect would be, because he knew people were familiar with it and were afraid of it, and was something that it would have a really visceral reaction to them if they read about these really real experiences and they can talk about it with each other. It makes sense that things like garlic become really essential for protecting yourself from vampires, because garlic is really essential for protecting yourself against disease. It's antimicrobial. It's like so important to have that. It makes sense to listen to old wives' tales, to listen to the immigrant woman who's also a midwife telling you stories about how to protect yourself, because they know things. They know things. And so it really played a huge role in the 19th century. I once read a tweet that said, "Interview with the vampire is so cool, I wish New Orleans was real." And I think about that all the time, because this city is like so implausible. It's like such a strange place. It has been described as an accidental city. It's like this strange, fertile place surrounded by swamps. And if you can believe in New Orleans, you can believe in anything. And it makes sense, you know? It's like there was so many bloodborne pathogens in the 19th century that we knew nothing about. So how are we gonna talk about it? How are we gonna mythologize that?
We did not realize when we put the call out for panelists. We were going for a broadly supernatural panel, and I don't think we realized quite how vampiric the focus was going to end up being.
Yeah.
But it's a wonderful.
It always happens.
It's contagious. So I would love to know from y'all, as the longtime vampire novelist and the initiated vampire novelist, for y'all looking at it from the angle of telling a fictional story about a vampire, what do you regard as like the essentials of a vampire story? What makes one work?
Well, I mean, I think at the core of it, the vampire is always the other. And I mean, there's so many vampire stories at this point, and so many kinds. Like, there's nothing that hasn't been done, you know? But for me, as not just a writer, but as a reader and like a lover, like consumer of a lot of vampire fiction, it's really, I constantly need to feel that this character is very morally gray, you know, and unreliable. I mean, I think Lestat is like the great unreliable narrator. But so it's like I need to be able to feel empathetic and sympathy, you know, for the character and what they've been through. But I also always want to feel like it might kill me and to not let my guard down. So I feel like everyone will have a different answer for that, but like that's definitely my personal feeling. So when I'm writing, I feel like the readership really loves the vampire characters, but I always try, like, right when they're getting too comfortable with them to
Make them
get the
dangerous
things
again.
come out.
And is that not just like a perfect description of New Orleans?
Oh,
Like, it is an
yes.
unreliable
Don't
narrator
get
that I'm
comfortable.
obsessed with and might harm me.
Off again, on again, absolutely. You got to take
Yeah.
some breaks.
Yeah.
Very
think-
beautiful, very dangerous.
Yeah, yeah.
I agree with the dangerous thing. I think we kind of got away from the dangerous thing with some Twilight and, you know, other like legends. And I think vampires became a little bit too romantic, you know, sometimes. But I think it'd be fun to have a real, like actually there was just one, Midnight Mass. I thought was really good. If you haven't seen Midnight Mass, it's a very dangerous vampire.
Okay, okay.
And it's fun to see that again.
On my list.
Yeah, I love what you were saying about it being representing the other, which is something people really have always had to contend with here. And so the idea of, you know, early like xenophobia, like who is that other person? This yellow fever was called the stranger's disease. It was already associated with people from out of town. You know, who is that other person? It was a multicultural, multilingual city, everyone living in one small French Quarter area, trying to get along. And so You develop these myths about the people that you don't know, the languages you don't know, the smells you don't recognize. I think the vampire lore really helps people talk about that and process that. And monsters and mythologies really reflect our anxieties as a culture. And I think that's important. That's an important role. And when you look at the history of a mythology, you see how those anxieties shift.
Marita, the fact that it is possible to run a vampire-themed boutique is one incredible just factoid for all of you to bring home, and it's like the only one there is, yeah?
Well, no, since I've had mine a few years ago, the Glass Coffin opened up in Austin, and there's Vampire Fangs, I think it's called, and I don't know where they're based. It might be Los Angeles. All really cool places.
Okay,
shops,
okay,
yeah.
you're a
Like,
trendsetter.
Yeah.
I'm curious. Okay, so there's obviously not, you don't get to like pre-order a batch of merchandise that's for the vampire shop by default.
No.
And you are having people come in who are probably on some level very serious about their I'll say fandom without trying to be dismissive about it, but who want to live sort of a lifestyle at some level. And you're going to have people come in who they're kind of titillated, and you sell custom fangs and you sell fanged rubber duckies. Like, in a very small space, you're covering a huge spectrum. So I'd love to hear how you think about like meeting the variety of expectations that are out there and who it's for, if there is an answer to that.
So I started the shop wanting it to be a place that vampires would shop, and we're just opening it up for the first time to mortals. And so we carried the candles, which are still our biggest seller. They're fortune candles. They have charms inside, and each charm, when you see it, will relate to the customer because we choose the right candle for them. But we have hundreds pre-made. So it's kind of like a Harry Potter experience where like the wand chooses you, our candles choose you. We go back, and I try to make it theatrical. When I was working there, I'd be like, oh gosh darn it, or whatever. But anyway, so that was fun. And we have like great stories of people, like when they find the charms, the things that they found it and they couldn't believe it. But we listen to what they're saying, So anyway, that's fun. We had that, and I had very few things. I had leather journals, and we still have those, and fountain pens, things that vampires would come to a vampire shop to buy. And perfume, rose perfume from Houvet, the oldest perfumer in New Orleans. But then little by little, I started like watching things. And the rubber duckies, I'm trying to think if they came before Leah or not, but I have amazing staff, and they also have, and actually, we have about 150 artists now that make things just for us, and they found me, like almost all of them. I didn't go out searching for them, but they come in and were like, I make these really cool coffin backpacks. I'm like, that would be cool, or I make this or that. So it's stuff that's all handmade. It's a little bit more expensive, which is a problem sometimes. People are like, well, why is this, $12? And because somebody sat there and sewed that. Like, it's a closet bat that belongs in your closet. It's filled with lavender, and you hang it upside down, and it keeps the moths away. Like, it's a protective bat. So we have all those, like, kitchen bat. I really try to keep it vampire themed, and because we could, it's easy to go just gothic and whatever, but we really try to keep it vampire themed. So one day, the Bourbon Orleans Hotel overlooks my shop, and my husband and I, when we worked together, sometimes we'd be there till midnight, and we were working together. It was like 11 o'clock. And this couple walks in, and they're like, we're staying over there, and all day long, we've been watching people walk in, but we never see them walk out. And I'm like, yeah, that's our thing, But no, so I started showing her around the shop, and about a half hour goes by, and $300 they spent. And as they were walking out, I reminded her, I said, see, if somebody was watching you walk in, they wouldn't have watched you walk out, because they're not going to sit there and wait a half an hour. But we spent a lot of time with our customers, and that was my goal, is for us to be the French Quarter magical concierge. And that's how I built all my businesses. I want people, when they walk through any of our doors, to feel like family. And like, really, you're valued. You're a guest. You're not a customer, And we have people come back every single day that they're in town. And I get that, yeah.
It's very cool. To the question of delivering on vampire-based expectations, Alys, I'm very curious. So I've never attended the Anne Rice Vampire Ball, but I imagine it draws the more serious crowd. And you are around people who probably live and breathe vampire way more than you do, even as a vampire novelist. How do you deliver for those people like the immersive fantasy that they want? And since it's coming up, anything you're excited about for this year?
Okay, one short anecdote that I've never probably told before, because no one's ever really been like, when you were a kid, folklore. But I have this very distinct memory, and I was either like 15 or 16, with a friend from school. We were skipping school, and we were at the Crystal on Lower Decatur, if anyone remembers that, goth bar. And we met these guys, and we end up at their house, and it's like the middle of the day, by the way. And they have like all their rings, you know, with the fangs on them, and they're like explaining how it's to like slit their wrists because they drink each other's blood. And I remember as a 15-year-old,
Oh my God, I would not let you go there.
well, no one was really letting me go there, but as a 15-year-old, I was like, oh my God, these guys think they're vampires. You know, like really think they're vampires, and just like sitting there with a straight face and like being the, like, to my friend, like, we're getting the fuck out of here. Like, but that guy, there is a character in here based off of that guy.
Your book has vampires and people who think that they're vampires in the same book.
Oh, definitely.
Wonderful.
I mean, it wouldn't
Very
be
French
the
Quarter.
French Quarter without it. So, I mean, I think that having always been around, you know, every level of the kind of supernatural extreme, I think it is something that I just kind of grew up with. I've never really thought about it before.
It's your native language.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think too, the Anar's ball is different than other balls because you really, it's like sandals, you know, you pay for a ticket, it sounds expensive, but everything, you really are like at a party. You know, you're not paying for everything as you go or whatever. So you're there and you really feel like you've been invited to this vampire's home, and everybody is dressed pretty amazingly, like from Victorian vampires to, you know, all different kinds. And people, they lose themselves for a moment and really believe that they're in this thing, and it's a fun thing to do. You should come.
And I mean, the amazing thing about the Anne Rice ball versus some of the other kind of like gothic balls or wherever, or just fantasy balls or events, is everyone is united by the love for literature. And that's something that's like very special. You know, like you could be like a dentist and you could be a stripper, but like we are all like very quickly like coming together around this fandom, these books that like, oh, I read this when I was 13, but I'm 30. I read this when I was 13, but I'm 70, and like still have this shared experience. And it's really magical. If you haven't been, I highly recommend, but the tickets do sell out in like 2 hours, so you really have to follow.
Yes, we have a mix of day of ticket buyers and well in advance ticket buyers here in the crowd. I know that for reasons,
Yeah.
so plan ahead.
Yeah.
Plan ahead. We just have a last few minutes, y'all, so I want to take this a little bit into left field, just because I have so many more
Really been in right
questions
field.
for y'all, but we'll have plenty of options for like further conversation starters while we're all over at the Zika's house together. But one thing that I know no one would think to ask. So, Owen, we have been getting into, you know where this is going.
Gay animals, is that what you're asking?
We're gonna plug that. No, everyone knows to talk about that. So that's your conversation starter for Owen. No, yet another thing that we left off of your resume. So themes of the conversation so far. We have gone somewhat into kind of the role medically that back in a kind of less scientific time in the use of medicine, there was more of an element of like story and kind of a sense of lore about the cures that you used and the preventions that you used. And modern medicine often divorces that from the experience in the name of empiricism and in the name of a kind of like cultureless neutrality. And anyone who's been a participant in the medical system knows that that can be extremely alienating and really scary sometimes. So you have an experience with an unusual practice called medical clowning.
Wow, I didn't know we were going there.
Okay, yeah. So, no, because I want to take this in.
Yeah.
We've had a great call to action, go to the vampire ball. We have had a great call to action, go visit the vampire concierge, the magical concierges for the neighborhood. I want to give you yet another call to action, which is thinking about how you approach your own medical experiences in the future with the importance of lore in mind. So can you tell us a little bit, before we go into a quick lightning round and some plugs to round things up, a little bit about what medical clowning is?
It's all connected. We all We are meaning-making creatures. We want to tell stories about our experiences. We did that in the 19th century, we did that before, and we do that today when we have medical experiences. Like, we mythologize a diagnosis, even though that is just one part of who we are. I've worked for many years with a company called Prescription Joint. We work in hospitals in order to sort of reorient people to themselves and not just as a diagnosis or a patient. I think that it's really profound work, and it's not really different than what I feel like I do at the Pharmacy Museum, because it's reminding you there are a lot of different aspects to what your body is capable of, and that you are actually in charge of telling the story of that. We use a lot of humor and joy and storytelling in the hospital. But yeah, it's all connected.
What kind of effects did you find that it had? Because y'all, I know you largely, but not solely, worked with kids.
Yeah, a lot of pediatrics, a lot of hospice. I mean, misery loves company, am I right? And so hospitals can be really dark places. Again, they're some of the most haunted in the American landscape because of all that suffering. And so you can just allow the suffering to continue and just have a whole bunch of ghosts later, or you can try to intervene and help people process what that experience is. And so going into rooms and being with people who are sick, who are dying, and helping them like re-navigate their stories is really important.
It's really special.
It's really special. And when I did leave the Pharmacy Museum for a few years, and I worked at a place called Project Lazarus, which is transitional housing for people living with HIV. And it began at a time in which that was a death sentence, and people in New Orleans were just dropping bodies off. At a time when there was also a resurgence of vampire lore, because there was a lot of fear about bloodborne pathogens. And I found out, that was an incredibly haunted experience working in that space, doing that same sort of work, helping people to understand what this diagnosis is. What is this story? What is the othering that's happening? How are people with this diagnosis becoming the modern day vampire? And I found out that space was also the space where yellow fever victims were dropped off in the 19th century.
Oh, wow.
And it was the church that began the St. Roch Cemetery and the St. Roch Chapel and the St. Roch neighborhood, because they were constantly interceding with saints, what are saints if not ghosts, am I right? Like, constantly here to help us understand what it is to be human, what it is to suffer, and what it is to want to survive.
I mean, talk about making suffering beautiful. If you want to go to a place that does that, St. Roch Cemetery, any New Orleans cemetery,
yeah,
but that one in particular.
The story of that is they were like, St. Roch, please keep this congregation and this community, help us survive a yellow fever epidemic, which was so rare. And they're like, if you do, we'll build a shrine to you and a church. The church is now the Marigny Opera House, and that whole block is now the facility, Project Lazarus. So yeah, just like layers and layers and layers of people navigating death, story, mutual aid, care, survival, being like, we want to be in this city, we know it might kill us, so what are we going to do about that?
Cemetery art is a beautiful example of the way that New Orleans, almost uniquely, at least in the country, makes a point of beautifying something really difficult, and I love that the work you do offers a way that can be done while we're still alive. So. Yeah. There are ways not to wait till the very, very end to solve those problems. Y'all, I want to leave you with some ideas about what to talk with these folks about in the chance that you get to do so. So many questions that I didn't get to bring up with them. So ask Owen about ghost hygiene at some point. Fascinating little phrase that can be a jumping off point for some stuff. A lot of good things in there. We didn't get to really talk much about the hard reality versus poetic license question, but I do want to just drop the point that Alys's novels are something you could use to navigate New Orleans, like geographically. You could make them, there are maps in them, and you could make a map from them. No one should ever navigate New Orleans based on works of fiction. God knows, like Princess and the Frog, you'll get lost. But this is a fascinating example of an exception, so there is a lot of love for like the nitty-gritty of real New Orleans geography, ethnic, cultural makeup, et cetera. So definitely a conversation to have there. I do also want to really quickly just let y'all know what's going on in these folks' lives. So if you have enjoyed yourself and you want to get to know them better, you can. So if you want more of Owen's work, we mentioned Field Guide to Gay Animals, this same perspective on science meets storytelling, taken into I would argue, maybe a more lighthearted domain than where
Yeah,
we've been.
Yeah. Into evolutionary biology and nature.
And you can find lots and lots of stuff at owenever.com. And for Marita, if you would like Marita to be your magical concierge to the neighborhood, again, after we're done, the Vampire Apothecary right around the corner on St. Peter Street is open till 2 in the morning. Y'all crazy kids who stay out that late, it's a safe place to be, way better than Bourbon Street. So give that a chance, and definitely this brand newly out book, it's probably still warm, Mosquito, Southern Vampires, which you can tell the level of history nerd behind this. It is in the format of a Penny Dreadful, which is like the OG vampire story format, and there are recipes in it for the stuff that's served at these places. So you have some customers, and that book is going to be for sale over at ZK's house. So check that out, and y'all can find a lot of stuff at NOLAvampires.com for that. And then Alys has book 5 of this series coming out in the coming year, so you have time to catch up on the other 4 before that happens, if you get to work now. Book 1 is going to be over at ZK's house, and also mention the graphic novel Zatanna, so that's another thing you could look for in the meantime if you like New York. New York's fine. And AlysArden.com is where you're going to find that stuff. The new book is going to be called The Immortal Saint-Germain, so that particular legend being at the heart of it. I also want to throw accolades back to Lauren, who was our host. Y'all found your way into this via a lot of different paths. So I know some of y'all are already fans of what Lauren does, but if you're not, you are. You just don't know it yet. Like, Lauren does such a fascinating blend of things. Front and center in a lot of her work is making miniatures, and what is more like gothically adorable than making miniatures. And there's actually going to be some miniature making workshops going on under this one's leadership for the remainder of the weekend. And also throughout the rest of the month, there's going to be scavenger hunts. And you really could not ask to be in better hands for just like appreciating the vibe and the details and the aesthetics of New Orleans than Lauren's. And that's just stuff you can pick up online. She does so much else. She does mysteries in boxes on a rainy day like today. You can get all that wonder and mystery in your own room, in your own house. So lots of stuff to check out. And Lauren is definitely someone to chat up. She knows so many cool people. So definitely get recruited to the Lauren Rolodex in the course of the remainder of the night. Thank y'all so much for your time. Really, really appreciate you listening. Lauren, thank you.